In this lecture, we will see how to make use of variables in Terraform. We have used several arguments in our Terraform block so far. For the local file, we have a file name and content. And for the random pet resource, we have used the prefix, separator, and length as the arguments. Since these values are directly defined within the main configuration files, they are considered to be hard-coded values. Hard-coding values is not a good idea. For one, this limits the reusability of the code, which defeats the purpose of using IAC. We want to make sure that the same code can be used again and again to deploy resources based on a set of input variables that can be provided during the execution. And that is where input variables come into the picture. Just as in any general purpose programming language, such as Bash scripting or PowerShell, we can make use of input variables in Terraform. To assign variables, let us create a new configuration file called variables.tf and define the values like this. The variables.tf file, just like the main.tf file, consists of blocks and arguments. To create a variable, use the keyword called variable. This is followed by the variable name. This can be named anything, but as a standard, use an appropriate name, such as the argument name for which we are using the variable. Within this block, we can provide a default value for the variable. This is an optional parameter, but it is a quick and simple way to assign values to the variables. We will see the other methods to do so in a later lecture. Great! Now we have our variable configuration file. But how do we use it within the main.tf file? To do this, we can replace the argument values with the variable names prefixed with a var, like this. When using variables, you do not have to enclose the values inside double quotes, as you would when providing actual values. And using the same execution flow that we have seen many times by now, we can create the resources using Terraform plan followed by the Terraform apply. The resources have now been created as expected. Now, if you want to make an update to the resources by making changes to the existing arguments, we can do that by just updating the variables.tf file. The main.tf need not be modified. For example, let us update the local file resource to create the file at the same location but with an updated content that reads, "My favorite pet is Mrs. Whiskers." And for the random pet resource, let's change the length of the pet name to 2. We can do that like this. As expected, when we run Terraform apply, it will recreate the resources. The content of the file has been changed and the pet name now has 2 words following the prefix. Before we conclude this lecture, here is an example of what our configuration files would look like when creating an EC2 instance in AWS with Terraform while making use of input variables. Don't worry if the resource block and the arguments are unfamiliar. We have a separate lecture where we will be making use of AWS resources later in the course.